roughly for every truck that you convert from diesel operations to zero emissions, this is assuming green hydrogen, you're saving about 130 tons per year. So, and that's just one truck. About 800,000 trucks are made per year. So there's a clear pathway to scaling this up and having a very meaningful impact just within trucking.
Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Clean Techies, the podcast. This is episode 35 and this is the second episode for this week. Kind of doing a double feature talking about hydrogen and the fuel cell space. Today's episode, as mentioned last week or earlier this week, is with David Jaramillo, the CTO and co-founder of VERNE. This is a hydrogen storage solution that essentially is kind of like the gas tank you can think of a car, right? It's where you store the hydrogen prior to it being run through the fuel cell. So I think it's a very interesting conversation to follow up on right after earlier this week's topic with Corey about fuel cells. So I think very interesting topic in general. Really appreciated what David was able to share with us. They're doing some very interesting things. And of course, I think it's very exciting to see what they'll do this year. They have a trial being deployed this year, and we'll continue to grow and see what they do. So without further ado, let's make a quick mention to our sponsors, and then we can get into the show. So as always, thank you so much, Next Wave Partners, for making this podcast possible. Next Wave are experts in the recruitment space and talent acquisition across climate tech, renewables, ESG, and technology globally. So if your team is growing or you are looking to make a career change, please consider reaching out to Next Wave. You can do that at next-wavepartners.com, or you can reach out to one of their consultants directly through LinkedIn. And yes, thank you guys so much for joining today, and let's get into the show. All right, here we are with David. How are you doing today?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm very good, very good. I can't complain. So, I guess for everybody listening, why don't we just start out with give us a bit of your background, kind of how you got into the space and what you're doing today.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds good. So I've always been passionate about science, more importantly, passionate about the fundamentals. So I was actually interested in philosophy and chemistry and physics. And then in undergrad, I was also very interested in application, creating new technologies. So for a while, I was trying to figure out how to address both of those seemingly desperate fields, prototyping, application, and fundamental science. And then it was through inorganic chemistry and energy storage, battery, photophysics, that I could see how you could apply those to solve real challenges, mostly around energy storage and for renewable energy. And so after undergrad, mostly focused on which I focused on molecular chemistry and energy storage, I went to do a PhD at UC Berkeley in a group that I think fantastically combines doing fundamental science, but with an eye for application. That was Jeff Long's group. And he's most known for various things, but one of those is metal organic frameworks, which are basically materials that you can design, you can tune at the molecular level. So you can really choose a desirable property by tuning the atoms of the material. And it was through that I got introduced to hydrogen storage and all the different challenges and problems, both technical challenges, market problems, and started to think more deeply about that. And what are the metrics that matter? Is it just sort of these DOE targets? Are there other metrics? How far away are we from meeting those? And that's when I started to think more deeply about it and teamed up with one of my good friends from undergrad, Ted McElveen, who's one of the founders of VERNE. And one informal thing led to the next, and we took Dave Danielson's course at Stanford. It's now Stanford Climate Ventures. It's what it's called. It's an awesome program, awesome class. It's formerly a course at Stanford. And that's when we started looking at hydrogen storage, where it makes sense, where there are real market needs. And from that, we teamed up with a third co-founder, Bav Roy. So the three co-founders, we incorporated, started looking at this more seriously. Kind of fast forward today, I finished my PhD last summer. Ted and Bav graduated from their MBA programs at Stanford. So now we've been doing this full time, and the company is called VERNE, and we're focused on enabling hydrogen for zero emission operations of heavy duty transportation. So think hydrogen for trucks, hydrogen for planes, hydrogen for ships.
Got it. So is this focused primarily then on the fuel itself? Could you maybe walk us through like the technology specifically when you say enabling? Like that could be a number of things.
Yeah. So we fundamentally, we're starting from, you wanted to think from first principles as to what type of hydrogen makes the most sense. There's liquid, there's compressed, there's 350 bar compressed, 700 bar compressed. And what we wanted to solve for was what is the optimal, almost sweet spot for high density and low cost. And it's hydrogen that's known as cryocompressed. So it's both cold, but not all the way that it's liquid. And it's not compressed in how you normally see it today at 700 bar. And you combine benefits of both. So we're really developing a platform technology around cryocompressed hydrogen. And so the first product, the one we most developed so far, is on the storage side. You can effectively just think of it as tanks that go back and store the hydrogen. That's part of the equation. The other equation is getting hydrogen to be cryocompressed. So for that, you can think of on-site production, electrolysis, great. After that, we take care of the rest. We convert that hydrogen into this high dense state. So it's this process that really efficiently cools and compresses. So then you have the full supply chain for cryocompressed. So you can pull up in your truck at a refueling station, and the cryo compressor, as we're calling it, converts hydrogen to cryocompress, and that fills up the tank system that we've developed.
Okay, so it's focused on the tank system that is storing it. Okay, so I guess maybe there's a lot of things to unpack. Obviously, this is a very technical topic. Maybe could you talk about what specifically, obviously I understand you're focused on the trucking right now. Could you talk about some of the issues that have faced, making hydrogen adapted to the trucking space so far, and kind of how what you're doing now is really going to be able to help overcome those barriers to advance the space?
Yeah, and it's certainly very technical. We can happy to go in different directions to unpack this further. And so think about it just from trucking, and so where we are today and what's actually needed. So technologies today, what's been done historically, starting in 2000, there was a big push for hydrogen back then, and a lot of this was just on compression. Hydrogen is great in terms of its gravimetric density, but you really have to compress it to get at high enough volumetric densities. So the last 2 decades have really focused on how do we compress hydrogen and densify it as much as possible and store that. And that's 700 bar storage, also known as type 4 tank storage. And those systems they're good. That's mostly what's been used today. So Toyota Mirai, you can see them in California. There's probably 4,000 to 5,000 of those driving around. They use those type 4 tanks. And those are fine, but they're very expensive. It requires a lot of carbon fiber. As you increase the pressure, you need to increase the amount of carbon fiber. So cost is an issue for trucks. Trucks really need to bring down cost, capital, and operating, in contrast to light duty vehicles. So cost is a huge issue. The other issue is just the amount of hydrogen you can store. So it's still not good enough for what they're used to relative to diesel operations. And so trucks today have been trying technologies, fuel cell technologies, and using type 4 tanks, but they're still too heavy. So you can think of it as from the amount of hydrogen per weight of the system that you can store is still too low. So you eat up the payload that they can carry. So that's been a really big pain point. On the other hand, you also have other trucks. You can think of almost Amazon delivery, where a lot of boxes on there. You open a box and then there's another box, and then there's styrofoam, and then it's a little iPhone cover. So those are volume limited. So it's not necessarily payload, but volume limited. So these tanks take up too much space, and it's affecting how many goods they can carry. So those are the issues. Those are the pain points on the storage side today for trucks. And now they're looking for more dense solutions, both volumetric and gravimetric. And so what would really enable the fuel cells and electrolysis and enable the entire hydrogen ecosystem, one of the bottlenecks right now is storage. So if we can double the densities, that's going to make it easier for truck operators to try the technology and then utilize the electrolysis, utilize the fuel cell. So yeah, in some, storage is still a big issue, and we need better performance and better costs, both. And our solution aims to offer both of those.
Okay, so in terms of I think I'm getting the hang of this a little bit. This is quite deep for me, but I just want to unpack it a little bit. So there's the storage, kind of like the fuel tank, and then there's obviously the fuel cell itself that performs the energy creation, right? So is your solution focused on the energy storage, or the storage of it, and then as well as the fuel cell?
No, for onboard system, only you can think of it as fuel tank.
Fuel tank. Okay,
Just
got it. That makes sense. Okay. So that's interesting. So essentially, to try to put it in non-technical terms, you're trying to take this fuel and create it because it can be compressed, but compressing it to a smaller amount that it's not creating this heavy fuel tank that is taking up space or weight, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So finding that optimum and it's not compressing it further. It's rather looking at the phase diagram of hydrogen where there's really high density without going to too high pressure and without going to too cold of temperature.
Okay, got it. Okay, so then in terms of implementing this, could you talk about where you guys are with your technology now, or maybe specifically the cost? I'm very curious to understand the costs of operating, let's say, obviously let's keep focusing on semi trucks, for example. What are the costs of operating when you're using your technologies compared to conventional?
Yeah. So where we are today, we're doing our first physical prototype demonstration. So far, everything now has been extensive modeling based on previous work done by some national labs. So government-funded original work, proof of concept, really cool work. So we're taking that, making it commercial, making it sort of larger scale and road capable and other performance improvements. And so that first physical demonstration is going to happen this quarter. So you can demonstrate how much hydrogen you can store and all those things. We have a few other prototypes that we're in parallel building for other demonstrations. So early demonstration stage overall. And in terms of cost, so some of the pathways to cost. So to put some of the things in perspective, some of the targets with current technologies today, Type 4 tanks, you're probably at around $15 per kilowatt hour. And yeah, $15 per kilowatt hour. And so that is assuming you increase production even greater than what's being done today. For us, our pathway is a different one. So we're targeting about $8 to $9 per kilowatt hour stored. Another way to think about this is per dollar or per kilogram of hydrogen stored, X amount of money is required to store it. And because we have twice the amount of hydrogen in the given system, we just have much higher density. On a per kilogram basis, it's a lot cheaper. So on a dollar per kilowatt hour or dollar per kilogram, it's a lot cheaper. So about $15 per kilogram for technology today at higher scale than today. Ours, assuming same production, that's not today. We're making tens of these maybe, but around 5,000 a year, we should get to $8 per kilowatt and kilowatt hour. And then batteries, just as a reference point, lithium ion batteries probably around $120, $140 per kilowatt hour.
Okay, got it. Yeah, I think that's from my limited scientific and technical knowledge, has become pretty obvious that it's very difficult to solve with the traditional batteries for these trucks. So I guess maybe one thing I'd be keen to understand is the path forward initially going to be retrofitting existing trucks? Is it going to be building new ones? I'm really curious about the process, because I obviously understand, to me, this is one of the most fascinating problems of the climate tech solutions that we need to find is the the non-software solutions, right? The physical, the manufacturing, these things are very difficult to figure out, very expensive, capital intensive, et cetera. Could you walk us through that process, what you guys are thinking currently, and how you'll kind of go through that deployment process?
Yeah. And so it's very, very time dependent. So one of the things that we think the best pathway right now is retrofitting new trucks. So fuel cell trucks, focusing on fuel cell trucks. There's not too many, so that's almost a limiting factor. But for those fuel cell trucks, they're going to have those Type 4 tanks, as we can think of it as incumbent technology. So for our first demonstrations, we're building our system so they have basically the same exterior specs, so we can swap in our tanks for their tanks. So it's going to be retrofits for fuel cell trucks, and those are pretty new. And that's what we think we will be doing for the first few years. After that, there's ways where we can upfront working with the OEM further optimize the system. But I think it's not necessary. We can very much retrofit, and there's thermal integration that we can do on our side. But integration overall is not too complex. It's not, for example, going to influence the fuel cell or the OEM, the truck design.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. Obviously, I think that's like kudos to you guys for that. That's always a super difficult thing when it comes to, obviously the goal is to mass manufacture, actual machines. So that's helpful to understand. Maybe, just kind of stepping back a little bit, could you talk a little bit about the importance of solving this issue for, for commercial transport, given, the existing emissions that commercial transport makes up for every year? I'd just be keen to hear some data points that you have on that.
Yeah, and one of the reasons we're really passionate about it is because of the big CO2 abatement opportunity. That's sort of our true north. And so you can think of it as 16% of global CO2 emissions are around transportation. 6 of those go to light duty vehicles. And for that, we have a good sense of how we can abate most of those. Electric vehicles are fantastic. The remaining 10%, that's heavy duty. So 4% is trucks, 3% aviation, 3% shipping. There, we need a little bit of everything. So batteries can play a role to some extent. You have ammonia and shipping, methanol and synthetic aviation fuels. There's going to be a big mix. And the general idea is the thesis of electrify everything, of electrification, is not sufficient. So we need higher denser fuels, and really go after this 10% of CO2 abatement opportunity. And within trucking, once you go for operations that are 200 miles or more, that's when it might be very payload limited if you're using batteries. So there's a clear challenge, there's no clear solution. So that's sort of what we got excited, where there's a clear need to have hydrogen. And so the impact there is helping to go after that 10% of global CO2 emissions. And roughly for every truck that you convert from diesel operations to zero emissions, this is assuming green hydrogen, you're saving about 130 tons per year. So, and that's just one truck. About 800,000 trucks are made per year. So there's a clear pathway to scaling this up and having a very meaningful impact just within trucking. Of course, if this succeeds in trucking and there's more pilots available, our plan is to move into shipping and aviation, and just accelerate it. Time is important, and I think we can. That's incredibly important to us, not just the end state, but how fast we get there. And so I think part of our technology is based on getting to market as soon as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, obviously, of course, the faster you get there, the faster you can start to see any, improvements that could be carried on to the next iterations. What about the abundance of hydrogen, right? If there's, it sounds like there's already trucking companies that are building these heavy duty trucks that are fuel cell trucks. What is the availability to fuel these? Like, how does that look right now in terms of the infrastructure, and what are some of the major challenges that will be faced to build it out?
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's where most of the challenges probably lie. Kind of market risk, a lot of market risk, and this is an extensive infrastructure required, and it's massive scale we're talking about. So today, it's hydrogen overall per year. It's 90 million tons, 90 megatons per year produced, and about 20 kilotons go to transportation. So very small amount. So today, 90 million tons. By 2050, so end state for zero emission society, the amount of hydrogen required for transportation is expected to be on the order of magnitude of what we produce in total. So about 90 million tons just for transportation in 2050. So we're talking about converting everything we're doing today for this really established industry of hydrogen just for transportation. So it's a massive growth is expected, massive infrastructure. People are probably more aware of this on electrolysis. That's kind of on the more on the deployment side, massive scale being announced. And so that market's 100x growth in the next 2 decades. So very, very much in the early innings, very early stages. So for us, it is an issue in that there's not too many players, whether it's from production side, having enough hydrogen, it's very expensive today. 2 specialty vendors, all this requires specialty components, whether it's compressors to nozzles, that's limiting. There's not enough people in the game, not enough companies in the space. So those are all certainly challenges and a lot of risk. Same time, it's opportunity. And I think there's companies that are moving fast to capture this void that becomes more and more apparent every day. And so, yeah, that's overall, I think, where we are today. We're in second or third inning, very early. And for example, today, if we want to do some demonstrations, it requires a lot of work just to identify a fuel cell truck, figure out where we're going to get the hydrogen, figure out where the testing center is. There's a handful of testing centers where you could do this. And so that makes it part of the challenge of how do we maximize the limited resources to move as fast as possible.
Yeah, that's going to be fascinating. I think I have a couple other questions to get to, maybe pull on that thread a bit more in a second. But I'm kind of curious also about obviously when we talk about batteries, typical batteries, a lot of people are concerned about supply chain issues. What are some of the supply chain issues that are likely to be faced in this space, if any? Could you walk us through that process?
Yeah, well, the most obvious one is hydrogen production and getting it to the endpoint. But beyond hydrogen, for making the tanks, let's say, on the manufacturing side of the systems, the most notable one is carbon fiber. So our current designs use carbon fiber, and there is a big carbon fiber shortage. And so prices have been going up, and it's just making it hard. It's slowing things down. So that is a big risk, short carbon fiber. Beyond that, everything else, we're trying to make it so it's relatively easy to acquire, typical alloys and a few other components, and just specialty manufacturing. But yeah, so carbon fiber certainly stands out.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I think that obviously it's helpful to understand that there's essentially, if I understand correctly, the process of creating this clean hydrogen that can be used that's abundant, right? We won't run out of that aspect. It's just the other materials, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Okay, let's move on to, I think this is how we can tie this together here. Could you talk about the process of, it's my understanding that one of the, obviously, I think, arguably most prestigious climate tech venture firms, Breakthrough Energy Ventures, has invested in you guys, if I understand correctly. Could you talk about the process of, how you met them, how you came to get in contact with them, what was it like getting funded from them? And I think from there, we can talk about partnerships and solving some of these solutions from there.
Yeah. So we're part of their Niagara program. So it's not where we were not invested by Breakthrough Energy Ventures, but rather it's within the Breakthrough Energy to build this whole ecosystem to go from sort of science to scaling up, and to go from sort of science and prototypes to market entry. The new program is called Breakthrough Energy Fellows. It's part of their philanthropic arm. And that's the program that we were accepted to and that we're part of. And so we're incredibly grateful and excited, and it's already accelerated our development. But the overall thought there is we need a lot of shots on goal. There's a lot of great technology that no VC right now is willing to invest in. There's a lot of risks. But within about a 1 or 2 year time frame and some money, you can de-risk those and make a go, no-go decision, whether you can follow VC trajectory on funding and scale. That's kind of the premise of Breakthrough Energy Fellows. And that's where and so we fall under that sort of category. We need to de-risk a few of these concepts. And so in terms of partnering with them and how that whole process went, they're very interested in what are the technical milestones that first of all, what are the technical milestones that you can do in 2 years? And if you succeed, are you confident that you can then go on this VC trajectory and get to scale fast? They don't care so much about necessarily going on a VC trajectory, but they care a lot about getting a technology to the market. Mm-hmm. And so for us, and interacting with them in the early days, was trying to figure out, is this doable in 2 years? Like, what do we really need to do? If we do this, is it really true that we can then kind of get funding from private capital and start to scale up? And yeah, so we believe so, with about 1.5 years of some de-risking. But the pathway that led to us being part of this inaugural program was through, I think, many things. There's a few channel recommendations, I believe, through, we were lucky to have participated in one, that MIT Clean Energy Prize last year, which is very fun. But before that was, when I mentioned top of our interview, we signed up to do this class at Stanford called Stanford. Back then, it's called Stanford Energy Ventures. And I think that's the type of class that we just need to 100x in the world, in the US, to help get technologies out to market. So when we did that, that's when we thought about, different technologies. Let's focus with this product market fit. And throughout the course, you get guidance from people like Dave Danielson of Breakthrough Energy Ventures. And so it was sort of building that relationship and getting a sense of what's required. And then he sort of suggested that this could be a great program, and sort of one thing led to the next, and we applied and all that. So, but overall, I think it all starts with that class, that type of environment where you're able to create a team, do product market fit, get some guidance. And so the program formally started in September. It's been great. They've had some great speakers. Bill Gates spoke, John Doerr, a few others, and providing guidance along the way, and making sure we're doing our technical milestones and doing what we need to do within the time frame allowed so we can get to the market fast.
Okay, interesting. So that's very fascinating to me. This whole, a lot of people ask me, oh, why shouldn't we just if the technology is better, why shouldn't we just let the natural market tendencies kind of make their way to fix climate change? And I'm always, obviously you and I both know that, as we're talking about right now, the infrastructure problems, like there's so many things that need to be essentially quarterbacked. So I'm very fascinated by what Bev is doing with this. It sounds like they're really trying to tie all the pieces together as much as they can. Obviously, it's a great market opportunity for them too, but I'm curious, have you guys had specific interaction with maybe other people in their program that are in adjacent fields that would have to be, and as we talked about, there's other pieces to the puzzle. Have you been involved with them trying to make sure that things are on the same page? I think that integration at some point in the future would be important for some of these things. I'm just kind of curious if that's been a part of the process.
Yeah, you mean in how they think about how they could orchestrate partnerships between different companies. Yeah, there's been some of that. I think now, at least for Breakthrough Energy Fellows, it's very early stage companies. And so there's some companies that are doing electrolysis. And so there's clearly ways where we could partner with them because we really enable on-site production to become high density hydrogen. So we started early conversations and more kind of building what would be possible and how we could work together, but not in enough detail because I think right now it's still very early. But they certainly encourage that. And so it's very much, the cohort's quite close. We're meetings together quite frequently. So it's encouraged, it's informal, and part of that makes sense because it's still a bit early for us I think there's too much risk if we were to do a combined demonstration, for example. But maybe at the end of the program, that could be a goal. Yeah,
I think this is just fascinating. This whole idea of solving these solutions. Maybe the best way we could go next topic here. There's a number of things that they all kind of bounce into each other, which is what I found interesting with this space. But maybe I'd like to hear your thoughts on the regulatory side of things, right? As these technologies kind of get proven and some probably start to take off more than others, we obviously looked at the issue of integration. And at some point, in order to make it so that there's widespread integration, is there going to be, you think, an independent body that's going to say, hey, this is the standard right now? Or do you think the government will step in? And maybe could you talk about also, I know this is a lot of things, but it's just going to all be on this thread, about the risks of implementing a standard when there's possibly better technology to be developed that might fall outside of that standard?
Yeah, there's a lot there. So I think in general, another way to accelerate new technologies is if it were more accessible for startups to get clarity on certification pathways, and sort of navigating the different agencies is very difficult. But to answer your question, so there's various routes this could all look, and there's definitely governing bodies already, usually at least for hydrogen, it's very well established, what kind of the codes you want to follow and so on. There's just a lot of different bodies. So you typically have to consider a few, but one of the more notable ones is GTR code. So GTR, Global Technology Regulations, GTR, and then GTR 13 discusses hydrogen and sort of what's required in the standards. And so there's definitely clarity, there's definitely a pathway, but it's very different on US versus Europe, for example. And so, and versus, country by country, it's very different. So overall, it's very difficult. But for a new technology, there's usually at least some precedents they can kind of base it off. So we're basing things off GTR 13. But at the same time, our technology is, since it's a new way to do things, distinct enough where it doesn't necessarily it's not black or white, it checks the box.
Mhm.
And that's where we have to work with OEMs and do some sort of self-certification, working with them and get their buy-in. So that is a process that I think could be streamlined if a new body were established, or other ways to kind of guide startups in this. But it's really a big challenge. And it's not necessarily a question of will it get done, it's just when and how much money it will require. And yeah, and so I think typically by figuring out what are the incumbent technologies, what certifications are they based on, can we learn anything from that? And then once you do that, then I think also working with OEMs can help. So that's kind of what we're doing. Europe, I think working with OEMs is potentially less helpful. I think there's more sort of standard codes that everyone has to abide by. So it's a bit more strict. But yeah, that's the general pathway. And so we're gonna have to figure out very different strategies, US versus Europe and other countries.
What is your thought then on that last part about, when these standards get in place and, maybe a large number of separate OEMs, independently operating, decide to go down a certain route, and then a new technology comes along? Do you have any concerns about how regulatory affairs tend to affect these? You look at our country, for example, is focused around individual car ownership, right? Because that's kind of what the government pushed at the time, right? Whether that's a good or bad thing, we don't know. Could have been different. But I'm just kind of curious to hear your thoughts on maybe the things to consider, at least when government bodies are making these determinations.
Yeah, and so at least they're well aware of that, and I think the way the regulations are written, the standards, they try to be somewhat agnostic to what the technology could be, and think more on sort of the metric. And so it's sort of like if you have a failure mode, the hydrogen that's spent it has to be this flow rate. And so for more or less, they are made in that way, somewhat agnostic. But there's still going to be places for us, for example, where it's not clear. And so, yeah, I think it is a challenge. The thing they could do is these things are, from my understanding, not updated that regularly. Maybe every 4 years or so, they're updated. So I think if there was at least a more established way to engage, or some way where there can be kind of shorter feedback loops. But of course, it's gonna be very expensive. And so it's tough. It's definitely tough. But I think it's a challenge overall. I think the thing that could help is, maybe if there are shorter feedback loops and you don't have to wait 4 years to change the code so you can bring in on a new technology.
Yeah, I think this is super fascinating, right? Just like the pace of innovation, and obviously the only reason seems to be a problem right now is because we're trying to look at this from a global perspective of climate change facing the entire world. That's the only reason we're thinking about this, right? If it wasn't for that, we would just say anathema to everything else. We're going to focus on our own things, and it wouldn't be a big deal. Okay, let's see. How should we go from here? I guess I'm just kind of curious. Maybe it's kind of still on the regulatory side of things. Do you think that there's, we look at, for example, I think it was relatively recently that California put a date on no more sale of internal combustion vehicles. When do you think, or how soon do you think that we might be at a point where that would be possible to start seeing these bans come through for, traditional trucking, for example?
Yeah, so we don't make assumptions or haven't thought enough about when bans may occur. We're almost working on the assumption that they may never occur. Of course, California is different than most of the US and most of the world. But so we're not working on that assumption. And so the way we're thinking about it and what we're seeing is already today there is so much pressure from not the government, from customers, from whether it's Amazon, people demanding Amazon have a lower carbon footprint, or Walmart, et cetera. This is very relevant in Maersk and shipping, that there's enough pressure that's already happening today, that there's just a market need for them to have zero emissions, just the marketing aspect of it. So I don't really know when they would become when internal combustion engines will become illegal, if they will. It doesn't really affect our business model. But the more important part for us is when we can get kind of cost parity from, let's say, a TCO perspective or dollar per mile perspective for operations. And for that, so we're not assuming they're going to be illegal in that case. And instead, we're really banking on the increased production of hydrogen. And that really drive down the cost. So that I think is one of the more outsized impacts. as opposed to our storage systems or fuel cells, just the cost of production of hydrogen and bringing that down. And so today, if you go to the pump, there's a hydrogen station nearby here in SF. Developed, I think last time I checked was $16 a kilogram of hydrogen. So that's pretty expensive. So to reach cost parity, and in a way, kind of answer your question, for us, we're thinking it's going to already happen late this decade, where you don't have to assume any particular carbon tax or anything, just because hydrogen is going to go down, efficiencies are higher for these electric powertrains. And so that's what we care about, and that's what we're assuming.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing I'm curious, I was meant to ask this earlier. I know, for example, with Teslas, the maintenance costs are significantly lower. Is there a similar situation with these trucks as well?
Yeah. And so the technologies are quite similar. Powertrain, electronic powertrain, everything is more or less the same. It's just at the end of the day, it's a fuel cell, but it's all electronic. So you have almost all the similar advantages as you would in just a purely battery operated truck. So because of that, I think part of it is, yes, less maintenance costs for sure. But a lot of that too is we don't fully know. This is all pretty new. There's a lot of data on buses. So fuel cell buses have been operating for a long time, and all that data suggests, a lot less operating cost. But it's still the early days of fuel cells, and still the early days of a fuel cell powering a Class 8 truck, 500 miles. But overall, it suggests similar benefits as you're hearing about battery electric trucks.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I think that'll be fascinating to see, because I think about my parents and the amount of money they spend on maintenance for driving their vehicles. They don't typically take long trips, but if they had a Tesla, for example, it might be a different story, right? I think that'll be interesting to see those things play out on a large scale. This question might be, if you don't want to take a swing at this one, feel free to let me know, but I'm just kind of curious. This is something I've been thinking about as this podcast has rolled on, is the idea of with intellectual property, given that this is the challenge we're facing, climate change, what are your thoughts in general on why companies are still, I understand like there's capitalism, of course, but why companies are really, really holding on to patenting their technology, even though, if they start and grow, even if they grow at a very rapid pace, the ability to get across the globe with just their technology is going to be much slower than if they did, say, for example, what Tesla did, right? And help like make it available to other people, to other players to get into the space. What are your thoughts generally on this, if you want to comment?
Yeah, well, I'll just comment here without having thought too much about it. I think it's a really interesting question and kind of get to the heart of what I'm also really excited about, how to accelerate innovation. And for that, given that, I guess I haven't thought enough about it, but I think, so whatever I say is probably not that informative. I think my first reaction to that is, I'd like to look more on the data and understand a bit more. But I think part of that just has to do with having direct skin in the game. And I guess that's what sort of really capitalism is all about. So if I'm just thinking from our perspective, if it's our IP, we have more skin in the game, more motivation to put in the long hours, and it's sort of, we have ownership of the revenues, we have ownership of the impact. I think if you dilute that, and it's not black or white, the answer, but I think if you dilute that, you have less of that effect, less of that drive. But maybe you can compensate for that by just having many more entities just working as opposed to one startup working, as kind of you alluded to. So I don't know, is that something you think a lot about? I'd be curious to know what you think, or if you have any resources on this.
It's a very new idea to me that I'm just like starting to recognize that, if we're really trying to solve these issues, I feel like there should be some kind of happy medium made where, you can, maybe you make a partnership where you can sell your IP for a reasonable price. Obviously, you still want to make a profit. Whoever invented that should be rewarded. I believe in that. But I think that, if you could start to get this deployed in other places in the world, maybe you go to another market and you make an agreement. Hey, you get this technology, but you guys stay out of our playground for a while. Like, I just think that there could be something there to help accelerate the general adoption of these new technologies, while not bottlenecking it to one company's success or failure,
Yeah, no, and I think the last thing I'll say on that, I think the licensing our technology, that's something that maybe we'll think about down the road, but we really want to, build the full foundation and take it to market. But that's something we can think more heavily on. And part of Breakthrough Energy Fellows mission is more on getting into the market. So they care less about one company doing this. I think licensing model and thinking beyond the traditional sort of venture capitalistic model. Something, not that it's not capitalistic to license it, but I think that's something I just need to be more informed on. And yeah, interesting question.
Yeah, I'll have to keep that one going in the pod. Maybe some other people
Yeah.
have other ideas. Okay, just a couple things to kind of start wrapping things up here. What are your general takes on the education system? I think you talked about this a little bit before, but how can the universities, et cetera, help to get more people in these spaces? Obviously, I'm assuming there's a good number of people who are going into universities aren't really aware of these things, but if they had the focus of like, hey, like there's this climate technology that's out there that's being developed, I want to focus my studies kind of around that. I'm curious to understand the flow of people coming into this space for all of these new technologies, because institutional education is really going to be focused on what's existing, trying to keep ahead of the curve, but by nature of what they do, they're going to be slightly behind. So I'm just kind of curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I can answer it from, let's see, kind of a PhD's perspective, finishing up grad school. I think most people, even at UC Berkeley, are hesitant to kind of join a startup or don't really understand how it's a pathway. And even I think there's still too much of an emphasis on doing a postdoc and being in academia and staying in academia. I think there's already a few examples of fantastic models that I think we just need to 10x. And so Cyclotron Road, Elon Gur, and what he's done there is really exciting. So that's something where I think it's being scaled up. So now it's Activate, and they have it in throughout the US and New York. So programs like that, I think, make a huge difference. And we're still not even close to having the impact we could have, just because I just from friends that I have and others in grad school, just don't think that's a possibility, aren't sure that they're going to be able to make money after living on a grad student stipend for 5 years. It's pretty tough. So I think programs like that are incredibly helpful. And programs like ARPA-E, where the proposals and the projects are guided by what industry is looking for, what the industry thinks is innovation. And I think we just need more programs like ARPA-E, or just more ARPA-E fellows to helping move that money around and making sure that we're getting high output and high leverage from the projects that are chosen. So I think there's probably a handful of programs or institutions like Cyclotron Road, ARPA-E, that we just need to double down on. And I think we're very far away from fully having a more efficient system to get sort of people that just finished their PhDs to go do cutting edge innovative work at a startup, or creating products and working at an industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can imagine. I obviously have no real taste for what that's like, but I can imagine kind of the being immersed in it, right? You're going to typically follow the paths that most people follow. So it'll be important to start to get that to break it up from the traditional methods, and then to make it more normal to do things, do different paths. So I think that's interesting. Maybe, I guess in the big picture, like in a perfect world, what do you see kind of, how do you see this technology, just hydrogen fuel and fuel cell technology in general, how do you see it playing out and changing the world over the next 10 to 20 years in the kind of the ideal scenario? Maybe there's some things that you've thought about that, aren't really common ideas behind hydrogen. I'm just kind of curious to hear your outlook for the future here.
Yeah, well, in our technology specifically, part of the outlook, as we were just saying on top of the call, the hydrogen for transportation is going to dramatically increase. And so to the point where the scale today that's used for everything, for ammonia and oil refinery, would be strictly for transportation. So in 20 years, about 90 million tons would be used for transportation. So outlook overall, dramatic growth. But I think double clicking on that, I think what we're excited about in our outlook is having less of an activation barrier to try hydrogen. And so what that means is, rather than having to put down $200 million to have a 20-ton per day liquefaction plant that's massive and requires 4 to 5 years. Instead, you can do small scale electrolysis, small scale R system. You can get it effectively functions like a liquefaction plant because you're getting to a density of hydrogen that's just like liquid, but you can do it at small scale. So modular systems, decentralized systems, where you're a big heavy duty depot and you have 100 trucks, you just want to try 2 trucks, we can make that happen. One containerized system. And so having this modular growth is really going to accelerate the transition and match one-to-one demand with supply. And so that, I think, following that progress, following that relationship of demand and supply is going to be, I think, really important and what we're really excited about. So making it, modular and scalable, decentralized hydrogen.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay. And then I guess maybe the final question I'd be keen to understand, especially given your background, what would you say is your best advice for entrepreneurs in this space looking to make a difference, whether that be technical people who've gone down the very engineering background or the commercial side? Like what is your recommendation for people as let's say they're entering university or coming out of university?
Yeah, well, if these are folks looking for jobs, I think even if it's a highly technical startup that's focused on R&D like ours is, we still need so many just competent, passionate people. We don't necessarily need all hardcore engineers. And so I think whoever is excited and is passionate and competent should have the self-confidence to inquire at startups like VERNE or other startups that are doing very hard things, because we just need a lot of smart people on this. So that'd be one. I think just having more self-confidence. We just need a lot of smart, competent people, and you don't necessarily need to have that specific academic background or specific industry experience to transition to that startup you're really excited about.
Very good. I think that's great to hear. I think I would agree with that sentiment a lot. So awesome. I really appreciate you coming on today. This has been great. We'll have to have you on again as the technology continues to evolve and you guys continue to make your milestones. So very excited for this, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, that sounds great. And so we can find us on verneh2.com. We're actively hiring, so you can reach out to us, operations, engineers, kind of everything. We'll be growing a lot this year. So please feel free to find us there, reach out. And yeah, thanks a lot for guiding this conversation. I think there's a lot of fun follow-ups we could have. Looking forward to keeping in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited for what you guys do. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining on today's episode with David. Really hope you enjoyed the conversation. Hope it helped you learn a bit more about the space. I think, having this double episode week, especially on this kind of one topic, I hope it provides a lot of learning for a lot of people. Again, that's the whole reason we've started this podcast. So really hope you enjoyed it. And if you are joining us for the first time, again, please, as usual, subscribe and put on notifications so you can be made aware of more episodes in the future. And then, of course, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, we always appreciate our review. It goes a long way. It really does. Some people kind of underestimate that, but it's really, really powerful for us to help get the reach of this show up and to help kind of raise more awareness for the climate tech space. So please do that if that's where you listen. And of course, as always, share the episode with somebody you think that might find this interesting, maybe somebody who you've gotten into an argument with about these things in the past. Again, it's always great to hear from the technical people themselves to understand how these technologies work. And if you're interested to get more involved, feel free to join the Slack channel. Link is in the description, so you can be part of a community of other climate tech professionals and kind of amateurs, people learning. Just a really interesting place for people to interact. And then, of course, you can always subscribe to the newsletter, which comes out the 27th of every month. Connect with David on LinkedIn and reach out to them, maybe if you want to learn more directly. And then, of course, as always, feel free to hit me up on Twitter with any questions you might have. A quick teaser. So next week, we will be hearing from Brendan Banfield at Gridsight, which is an Australian company that essentially helps utilities utilize and manage distributed energy resources better than they have been, right? There's a lot of data that typically is either collected or not collected, and they're able to take that and basically help understand, kind of like essentially making microgrids out of the the broader grid to some extent, right? He'll explain it better in the podcast next week, but again, really interesting conversation coming up next week with Brendan. So really hope you guys tune in for that. But until then, we will see you next time on Clean Tech is the Podcast.